In the year 2012, construction workers were digging up a quiet parking lot in the English city of Leicester. They weren't looking for treasure. They weren't looking for a king. But 3 feet beneath the tarmac, under a faded yellow parking space marked R, they found bones. A spine curved and twisted. A skull split open by a savage blow. And when scientists ran the DNA, they nearly dropped their instruments. Because the man buried under that parking lot, forgotten for over 500 years, was a king of England. His name was Richard III, and for centuries we were told he was a monster, a hunchbacked murderer, a man who strangled 2 innocent children in their sleep just to steal a crown. But what if that was a lie? What if the real Richard was buried twice? Once in the ground, and once under 500 years of propaganda. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to find out exactly how he died on a muddy battlefield, betrayed by his own men. What really happened to 2 little princes who vanished without a trace, and how a parking lot in Leicester finally cracked open a mystery that has haunted England since the year 1485. This is the true story of Richard III. King history tried to erase. To understand how Richard ended up buried under a car park, we have to go back before the crown, back before the blood, back to a scared little boy born into a family that was tearing itself apart. Richard was born in 1452, the youngest son of the House of York. And if you know anything about English history, you know the name York meant one thing: war. His family was locked in a brutal, decades-long struggle for the throne against their rivals, the House of Lancaster. Historians would later call it the Wars of the Roses. But if you were living through it, it didn't feel like a war of flowers. It felt like a war that could swallow your entire family alive. By the time Richard was 8 years old, he had already lost his father and his older brother. Beheaded. Their heads displayed on the gates of a city as a warning. Imagine growing up with that. Richard survived, and when his eldest brother, Edward, seized the throne and became King Edward IV, young Richard did something that would define the next 20 years of his life. He stayed loyal, fiercely, unshakably loyal. While other nobles switched sides like changing coats, Richard never once betrayed his brother. He fought for him. He bled for him. He was, by nearly every account, the one Yorkist prince you could actually trust. Now hold on to that thought, because it's about to become very, very important. There's also something else you've probably heard about Richard, that he was a hunchback, twisted, deformed, a villain who even looked evil. But here's a question worth sitting with. What if that image wasn't history? What if it was fiction, written 100 years after his death, by playwrights working for the family who killed him? We'll come back to that, because the real Richard and the Richard the world remembers are about to become 2 very different people. For 12 years, Richard served his brother without question. He ruled the north of England in Edward's name, and he ruled it well. Fair, effective, respected. If the story had ended there, Richard might be remembered today as nothing more than a loyal duke, a footnote. But then, in April of 1483, everything changed in an instant. King Edward IV, only 40 years old, fell suddenly ill, and within days, he was dead.
England was in shock, but the real crisis was only the beginning, because Edward's heir, the boy who would become the next King of England, was only 12 years old. His name was Edward V, a child about to inherit a throne that powerful men had already killed for. And on his deathbed, King Edward made one final decision. He named his brother Richard as Lord Protector, the one man who would guard his son and guard England itself until the boy was old enough to rule alone. For a moment, it seemed simple. Uncle protects my nephew. Loyal brother honors his final promise. But power has a way of poisoning even the people we trust the most. Richard rode south to collect his young nephew and escort him to London for the coronation. And almost immediately, things started to unravel. Richard intercepted the boys' traveling party. He arrested members of the Queen's family, the Wolverines, accusing them of plotting against him. Some were executed without trial. The Queen Mother, Elizabeth Woodville, terrified for her children's lives, fled into hiding with her younger son and her daughters, seeking sanctuary inside Westminster Abbey. Within weeks, the coronation of young Edward V was postponed, then postponed again, and the boy king, along with his younger brother, was moved into a royal residence for what officials called safekeeping. That residence was the Tower of London. Now, at this point in the story, the tower wasn't yet the symbol of doom it would become. Kings had stayed there before their coronations for generations. It was normal. It was expected. But something about this felt different, and the people of London could feel it, because in the months that followed, the boys were seen less and less, and then, one day, they weren't seen at all. What happened next would become one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in English history, and it would follow Richard's name for the next 500 years. Picture it. Two little boys. Edward, 12 years old, and his younger brother Richard, just 9. Sons of a king, heirs to a throne, living inside the Tower of London, waiting for a coronation that keeps getting pushed back. At first, people in London see them sometimes, playing on the grounds, practicing archery. A servant later recalled seeing the older boy, Edward, in the days before he vanished, and said the boy looked afraid, said he confessed to a priest every single day, as if he believed each one might be his last. And then one day, in the summer of 1483, the sightings simply stop. No announcement, no explanation, just silence. While the boys disappear from view, something else is happening outside those tower walls. Their Uncle Richard is being told something extraordinary. He's told the boys are illegitimate, that his brother Edward IV had secretly been pre-contracted to marry another woman before he married the boy's mother, which, under the law of the time, would make his marriage invalid, and that would make his children not true heirs to the throne at all. Whether this claim was true or was the most convenient lie in English history, we may never fully know. But Richard acts on it. Parliament formally declares the boys illegitimate, and the crown passes to Richard. He was crowned King Richard III on July 6, 1483. Some historians point to Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, Richard's closest ally, who had access to the tower and who mysteriously turned against Richard just months later. Was he covering up his own crime, or punishing Richard for one he didn't commit? Others point somewhere far more dangerous, to the man who would ultimately kill Richard and take his throne. A man who, once he became king, had every reason in the world to make sure those boys never resurfaced to challenge his claim. His name was Henry Tudor, and Tudor's family would go on to write the history books for the next 100 years. Convenient, isn't it? We still don't know to this day exactly what happened to those two boys in the Tower of London. Bones were found in 1674, buried beneath a staircase, believed by many to belong to the princes. They were reburied in Westminster Abbey, but never properly tested. Officials have refused again and again to allow modern DNA analysis, which means the most famous murder mystery in English history has never actually been solved. Richard wore the crown, but he never escaped the accusation, and it was about to cost him everything. Richard was now king. The throne he may have killed for, or may have simply inherited through a legal loophole no one could agree on, was finally his. But a crown taken under suspicion is a heavy thing to wear. From the very beginning of his reign, whispers followed him everywhere. In great halls, in marketplaces, in quiet corners of London where people didn't dare speak too loudly. The question was always the same. What happened to the boys? Rebellions broke out almost immediately. The very allies who had helped him take the throne, men like Buckingham, turned against him within months, accusing him publicly of murdering his own nephews. Richard crushed the rebellion. Buckingham was executed, but the damage to Richard's name was already done. It would never fully heal. And then, as if fate itself wanted to test how much one man could endure, Richard's world began collapsing from the inside. In April of 1484, his only son and heir, Edward of Middleham, died suddenly. He was just 7 years old. Contemporary accounts describe Richard and his wife, Queen Anne Neville, as absolutely devastated. One chronicler wrote that they were, quite almost out of their minds, with grief. Barely a year later, Anne herself fell gravely ill. Some whispered she had tuberculosis. Others cruelly whispered that Richard had poisoned her, eager to remarry and produce a new heir. There's no real evidence for that claim, but by this point in his reign, people were willing to believe almost anything about Richard. In March of 1485, Queen Anne died. In the space of 2 years, Richard had lost his only child, and then his wife. He was a king sitting on a throne soaked in suspicion, utterly alone, with no heir to secure his legacy, and no wife left to comfort him. And somewhere across the sea, in exile in France, a rival was watching, waiting, gathering an army. His name was Henry Tudor, and he was coming for the crown. Richard didn't know it yet, but he had less than 6 months left to live. August 22nd, 1485. A muddy field in the English countryside near a small town called Market Bosworth. 2 armies stand facing each other across the grass. On one side, King Richard, but logic doesn't account for betrayal. As the battle begins, Richard has thousands of men at his back, but a huge portion of that army belongs to a nobleman named Lord Thomas Stanley and his brother William. And here's the terrifying part. Nobody, not even Richard, knows which side they're actually going to fight for. Stanley had married Henry Tudor's mother. His loyalty was never guaranteed. Richard was so uncertain of him that he had taken Stanley's own son hostage before the battle, threatening to execute him if Stanley betrayed him. The battle rages. Richard watches from higher ground as his forces clash with Tudor's in the valley below. And then he sees something, an opportunity. Henry Tudor, separated from the bulk of his army, riding with only a small guard. Richard makes a decision in that instant that would define how history remembers him forever. He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't hide behind his army like a cautious king protecting his own life. He gathers his household knights, lowers his visor, and personally leads a full-speed cavalry charge directly at Henry Tudor, directly at the man trying to steal his throne. It very nearly works. Richard's men crash into Tudor's guard. Richard himself, according to witnesses, cuts down Tudor's standard-bearer in single combat and gets close enough to almost reach Henry Tudor himself. Almost. Because that's several of them almost certainly delivered after he was already dead. A final, brutal message to anyone who might still think of him as king. He was 32 years old, the last English king to die on a battlefield. Legend says his crown, knocked from his head during the chaos, was found hanging in a hawthorn bush nearby and placed directly onto Henry Tudor's head, right there on the battlefield. But what happened to Richard's body afterward is almost more disturbing than his death. He was stripped completely naked, thrown over the back of a horse like a sack of grain, and paraded through the streets of Leicester for the public to see, proof that the king was truly, undeniably dead. He was then buried without a coffin, without a monument, without a single mark to show a king of England lay there. Henry Tudor took the throne and began, almost immediately, rewriting the story of the man he had just killed. For the next 500 years, Richard III's grave was lost. The friary where he was hastily buried, a place called Greyfriars, was torn down decades later during the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII's reign. Buildings rose on top of it, streets were paved over it, and eventually, a city council built a parking lot directly on top of the forgotten friary, with absolutely no idea what lay beneath. For centuries, there was even a myth that Richard's bones had been dug up and thrown into a nearby river out of spite. Some believed there was nothing left to find at all. Then, in 2012, a team of archaeologists and historians, working off centuries-old maps and a healthy amount of educated guesswork, got permission to dig beneath that Leicester parking lot. On the very first day of digging, in one of the very first trenches, they found a leg bone, then a spine. Curved dramatically to one side, consistent with a condition called scoliosis, something Richard was rumored to have had in life, but which Tudor propaganda later exaggerated into a monstrous, twisted hunchback. Then they found the skull, and what they saw made the entire room go silent. 2 devastating wounds to the base of the skull, exactly the kind of injuries a man would suffer if he were struck down while his helmet had been knocked off, bareheaded, in the middle of desperate combat. The team sent samples for DNA testing, and they found something remarkable. A living descendant of Richard's family line, a man in Canada named Michael Ibsen,
traced back through an unbroken maternal bloodline to Richard's own sister. Scientists compared his DNA to the DNA extracted from the skeleton in that parking lot. It was a match. On February 4, 2013, the University of Leicester made the announcement heard around the world. The skeleton found beneath that parking space marked R was, beyond scientific doubt, King Richard III. The battle wounds matched historical accounts exactly. The curved spine matched contemporary descriptions. Even the isotopes in his bones told scientists where he had lived and what he had eaten as a child, matching his known biography almost perfectly. 500 years after he was thrown naked over a horse and buried without ceremony, Richard III had finally been found. In 2015, he was given the funeral he never received, a proper royal procession, full state honors. He was reburied inside Leicester Cathedral in a tomb of Swaledale stone, watched by descendants, historians, and millions of people around the world. But even with his body finally found, the biggest question surrounding Richard III was still nowhere close to being answered. Was he really a killer? So, after everything, the childhood shaped by war, the fierce loyalty to his brother, the missing princes, the crushing grief, the betrayal on a muddy battlefield, and the 5 centuries spent buried beneath a parking lot. He led his own cavalry charge into the heart of a battle he could have watched safely from a distance, and he died with a sword in his hand rather than fleeing to save his own life. Whatever else he was not a coward. And in the end, the physical evidence tells a very different story than the legend does. No monstrous hunchback, just a man with scoliosis, a curved spine hidden well enough beneath his armor that few who met him in life even mentioned it. A very human condition, twisted by his enemies into something grotesque. So I'll leave you with the same question historians have argued over for 500 years, and honestly, we may never fully answer. Was Richard III a ruthless killer who murdered 2 innocent children to steal a crown? Or was he the most successfully slandered king in English history? A man history buried twice, once in a forgotten grave, and once beneath a story he never got the chance to defend himself against. Let me know what you believe in the comments below.